feel compelled to make a note here before this episode. Several of my episodes, including this one, end up mentioning my dad in some way. He just seems to keep popping up and has become an unintended theme in the first season of Shadow Clock. I don't really know what to say about that, except that it's not something I planned. If you listened to episode 3, you know that he passed away when I was a kid. This said, I guess his continued presence in Shadow Clock really goes to show that the people we have in our lives really do make an impact, even after they're gone. And I'm betting many of you have someone that you feel this way about also. All this to say, if you've noticed my dad keeps making little cameos in these stories I've been telling, I've noticed it too, and it's not on purpose. It just keeps happening. So I guess maybe this is a good time for all of us who miss someone that really has made an impact on our lives, even after so many years that have passed, to take a moment and reflect on just how much that person means to each of us. As always, thanks for listening. I have loved doing each and every episode of Shadow Clock. In just a minute, you'll be hearing from my dear lifelong friend, Kristen. I've known her since I was literally a few days old. She's a pretty private person, so we're not going to use her last name. This story is about 3 distinct moments in Kristen's life in which she felt her father's presence after he passed away. I guess some may find these kind of experiences comforting, and others may find them unnerving. Me, I find them completely intriguing, and often wish I could have one of my own experiences like this with my dad, who died when I was 11. Whether you believe such experiences are simply our brains making connections to things we want to be there, even if they're not, or truly signs from the beyond. What I love about Kristen's moments is that they entertain the idea that just maybe it's her dad giving her a nudge or saying hi. Welcome to another Zoomed In Moment episode. I'm Katie Mahalik, and this is Shadow Clock.
Kristen, thanks so much for being here today. One thing I'd love listeners to know is that you have been like an older sister to me my entire life. And so the reason I know this story and this particular moment, which by the way is 3 moments, is because I've known you so long. So please tell our listeners and talk to me about the first moment you felt like your dad really made his presence known after he had passed away.
I'd be happy to. I'm also happy for the opportunity to talk about him and to think about those experiences. So his name was Gary. He was born in Brooklyn, New York, and he left there to go to college in South Carolina at the Citadel. So that's a military school. And from there, he joined the Army. And he went to Vietnam twice. He met my mom before going over the second time, and she was also going over. So they were kind of dating in Vietnam. And they ended up getting married there, their last day there. Then from there, they went on a 50-day honeymoon and ended up back in the States. It's interesting because neither of them had met the other's parents beforehand. So when they came back, that was part of the tour, was to meet the parents. And from there, he stayed in the military. So we kind of traveled around a little bit around the States. We did live in Korea for a year, then Kansas, Alabama is where I spent most of my youth before we moved to Wisconsin.
It was there in Wisconsin that my dad, Lance, and Kristen's dad became good friends. Though my dad was not military, both he and Gary were working at St. John's Military Academy, which is known today as St. John's Northwestern Military Academy.
He was pretty interesting. He called himself a Renaissance man, and it really was true. He had a lot of different interests, and he wasn't just, science-based. He was an engineer, but he was also into the arts. He was a really good drawer. He was a very good painter, and he was just really good at shadowing and just a very good artist. He was also but he read about astrology and numerology, and, so he had a very open mind. He was a pretty, big guy physically, big personality, big voice. So he occupied a lot of space in his life and in our lives. And, so when he passed away on Veterans Day in 2008. So it's just a big loss in our lives. It was very quiet after that.
And how did your dad pass away again?
He had a heart attack. He had congestive heart failure, but he also had diabetes. And both of those things are connected to his service in Vietnam through Agent Orange. But I remember when we were at the funeral home afterwards, and the guy was giving us the options, telling us about the casket. And the other choices we could make. And he must have just looked around the room at our faces and he asked us, was this sudden? I mean, he had congestive heart failure, which I guess, should have been a clue to us because it includes the word failure in it. But, it's like whenever you hear someone has cancer, at least me, I just never think they're going to die. I think they will always recover. And so maybe everyone in my family is kind of like that. Like you just don't really want to believe that. So in a sense, it was sudden, even though he had a bad heart and, other health conditions that affected it.
Can you tell me a little bit about what you said at the funeral that day on behalf of your dad?
So during the funeral in the church, one of the things I remember saying was that he was a very big personality and that I was sure that I would be able to still feel that, like that just wouldn't disappear forever. So I was going to look for something. I just really felt like this can't be it. You can't be that big and occupy so much space in this world that it's just gone. So I was going to, look for those signs that he was still around. And so this story that I told you about actually happened within the week of his passing.
Before we get to that first moment, you'll need to know 2 brief anecdotes about Gary to understand why Kristen connects this first event to her dad. The first story has to deal with a shoe.
So my dad had neuropathy in his feet from diabetes. So there was numbness, couldn't feel them sometimes. So it made it difficult to walk. And there was this time where he and my mom were at church and he was sitting there and he kept thinking oh, my foot is really bothering me. Like something is wrong with my foot. And so he can barely walk. He gets home. The first thing he does, sits down, takes off his shoe, and he puts his hand in there. He kind of feels around, and he pulls out his checkbook. And it somehow during the week, his checkbook had fallen into his shoe. And when he put it on, he didn't feel with his toes that there was something there. He just kind of shoved the checkbook up into the toe of his shoe. And, it became just like a funny story. We all kind of laughed about it.
The second thing you need to know about is Gary's love of birds.
He and my mom had this contest to see who could see the first robin in the spring. And we, every time we were in the car and we were, traveling on the highway or kind of a longer distance, we had a contest to see who could see a hawk first. And then he made a rule that if you ever saw a hawk on a green highway sign, you won for life. And then I saw a hawk on a highway sign. So yeah, I was a lifetime winner for the hawk game. So I guess I have always had kind of this bird connection with him.
Okay, so bring me into the moment when you kind of feel like your dad gives you this sign. You're at home, you're with your partner, Jeremy. About how long after your dad had passed did this happen?
So I would say it was probably about 3 or 4 days after the funeral. I was, trying to, catch up with work, and there was a work outing, and I'm upstairs getting ready, and I hear some kind of commotion that I can't really identify. And Jeremy, he makes some kind of noise that I also can't identify. It's not like horror or shock, or it's just kind of like I couldn't figure out what it was. So I came downstairs, and at the bottom of our stairs, we have a closet, and he's sitting on the floor, and I look down, and right next to him is a little bird, like a live sparrow that's just sitting there. And I'm trying to understand what's happening here. And I just said, where did that bird come from? And he said that he had got me shoes out of the closet, and he put his foot in and he felt something in the toe of his shoe, like he couldn't get his foot in there. So then he kind of squatted down and he held his shoe upright and tapped the heel on the floor to dislodge whatever was up there. And this little bird popped out. And it wasn't freaking out or trying to flap around. It was just sitting there. It was really strange. And then I kind of snapped back into it. I'm oh my God, we have to go. We're late and let's get the bird out of the house. And so we just kind of shooed it around and got it. It never flew. It was just kind of walking and kind of, running around, and we got it to the side door, and that was it. But I can't imagine how this bird got into the house. I can't imagine how the bird made its way to that closet because the door is usually closed, and why he went into a shoe. None of it Because in the moment I was like, oh, weird, there's a bird here. I got to go. Let's just get it outside. But, when we had time later to just kind of think about it, it's like, what? Like, how did that even come about? And within the next couple of days, I told him, I was like, Jeremy, that story reminds me of that checkbook. And he said, oh, yeah, it is pretty similar.
Now, did Jeremy and your dad have a good relationship?
They did have a nice relationship. Jeremy, he's a really good listener, and my dad had a lot of great stories. And, that was kind of their relationship, that Jeremy would listen to him. So they appreciated each other. Probably about, 6 months before he passed away, he told Jeremy that he thought of him as a son, which was very nice.
Now, what did Jeremy think about all of this?
He was just perplexed. I mean, just like that look on his face and that noise that he made when I was upstairs, I think he was just like bewildered. Like he couldn't figure it out at all.
Okay. So then how many years pass before you have this moment with the photo on your dresser?
Yeah, it's a pretty long time. So this is a very literal, easy to make the connection story. Like so much, in fact, it doesn't even feel real. And so it's quite a while. It's, probably 3 years ago. I woke up on a Sunday. It was Father's Day. And I, was getting ready in my room and I turned to leave. I opened the door and I was leaving and I heard kind of this clatter behind me. And I turned around and I had this picture in a frame on top of my dresser. And it was of me and my 2 brothers at one of my brother's weddings. And that picture, when I turned around, it was not on my dresser. It was on the floor and it had come off the dresser and landed upright on the floor with that little easel at the back of the picture frame. It was out. So it was sitting on my rug and the glass had shattered in it, but it was, otherwise perfectly fine. And, it wasn't like right next to the dresser, like it had just like kind of fallen over and down. It was about a foot away from the dresser. And, you just like your brain immediately tries to rationalize it, like, is the window open? Did it? But I kind of just let that all go. And I just kind of like enjoyed the moment of that.
I love how Kristen says she just decided to enjoy the moment. Of course, nothing can be proven, and like Kristen said, there are probably many things that could rationalize it all. I thought about how for someone else, something like this might actually have been scary. But in Kristen's case, this was the kind of sign she had asked for that day in the church when she said goodbye to her dad at his funeral. I couldn't help but think, what an amazing Father's Day gift just to accept it all for what it was. Because it allowed her and Gary to share a moment between just the 2 of them, even after he was gone.
When we talked before we did this interview, you told me about one moment specifically that literally happened the day after your dad passed. Can you tell me about that moment?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Yeah. It's so, I don't even think of that because it's so off the wall. But the day after my dad died, I got an email from him. I had been on the computer because people were emailing me condolences and everything. And so I was kind of immersed in that, like stories that people were telling me about my dad and how great he was. And an email from him popped up in my inbox. And I literally scooted my chair back and pushed myself away from my desk because it was shocking. And then, I kind of looked around. I'm like, what's happening? I'm trying to figure out what's happening. That really scared me. The other 2 things didn't scare me. I was happy to have that experience. And this really freaked me out. And so finally, I just kind of scooted closer to the desk again and I clicked on it. And it was some stupid joke he had sent me. And I was just amazed. I mean, such shock. And I tried to, again, rationalize it. In this case, I needed to rationalize it because it scared me. And I thought, it must have been caught up in some filter and something happened, his computer went down and it just was sending things out like that. And yeah, that was weird.
I mean, I think it's distinctively strange. And yes, it can be rationalized by, technology, et cetera. But I find it so interesting that out of all of them, you didn't give it a ton of weight. And it's probably because it did scare you at first.
Yeah, it is interesting because even now when you just asked me, I didn't know what you were talking about because I have, and I never even tell that story or bring up that story. I don't even know if I told my family about that story because it was just it happened in such a time of abject grief. And I, was feeling so terrible. and then to get a joke from my dad. And then much later when I thought about it, I was like, that is exactly what my dad would have done. Sent me a terrible dad joke the day after he died. Yeah. But I do have to say, like, all along, I can't call them necessarily like a sign or really, like a literal connection with my dad. But, all along, there are just many times where I think that things would happen that just kind of triggered in my brain memories of my dad. Like every spring when I see robins, it makes me think of my dad. And when I see one, I just think like, oh, there's my dad, or I'll go to visit his grave and there'll be a robin there.
I feel like Kristen reminds us that there are so many ways to keep the ones we miss close to us, and that we can use everyday moments in our lives to remember the ones we love. Shadow Clock is an independent, out-of-pocket podcast. If you feel so inclined to donate, head over to our website at shadow-clock.com and click the contribution button. All monetary contributions go towards pumping out our next episode. This episode of Shadow Clock, including the editing and sound mix, is created by me. Social media is managed by Spencer Masternak. Kate Cosgrove creates original illustrations for each episode of Shadow Clock, which you can also see at shadow-clock.com. Music is credited to Pond5. Content contributors, composers, and individual song titles for each episode can be found on our website at shadow-clock.com. If you like today's story, which focuses on a smaller moment in life, take a listen to our longer episodes that are not specifically specified as a zoomed-in moment. Our non-zoomed-in moment episodes tell the tales of more complex true life moments that will take you through the twists and turns of life's journey. Don't miss hearing from Bob, a former bank robber who did 5 years in Alcatraz Penitentiary, or biologist Diego, who was kidnapped while doing fieldwork in Colombia. And you definitely want to hear about the 150-year-old mummified remains of a child discovered in the backyard of a San Francisco home. If you like the show, spread the word by telling someone else about Shadow Clock, and of course, by following us on social media. The more people who know about Shadow Clock, the more people we can keep sharing these true life moments with. Thank you to Alejandro Velez, Kate Cosgrove, Matt Sorrow, Spencer Masternak, Adam Gould, Bruce Sibley, Alec Jansen, Adam Zavislak, Mary Brem, Miles Brem, Cindy Mahalik-Hagerson, and Forest Hills Northern High School in Michigan. In closing, a huge thank you to Kristen. I'm so grateful for our friendship and love our conversations. I'm Katie Mahalik, and this is a zoomed-in moment episode of Shadow Clock.